My name is Cody Nunn, and I'm an immigration attorney at Swanson in Cleveland. Today, I'm going to talk about the new Form I-9 and the virtual document review option, officially called the alternative procedure, and what employers need to know. First, I'm going to talk about what has been historically required with regard to the Form I-9 process and what led to the new changes. I'm sure most of you in the audience are familiar with the Form I-9. All U.S. employers are required to properly complete a Form I-9 for every new employee hired after November 6, 1986, for employment in the United States. The purpose of the form is to confirm the employee's identity and work authorization, and it has two main sections. Section 1, which is completed by the employee on or before the first day of work, and Section 2, which is completed by the employer by the third business day after the employee's first day of work. To complete Section 2, employees were required to present in person their documents that establishes their identity and work authorization, and employers or their authorized representatives were required to physically review the original documents presented by the employee and certify that they have examined the documents. And then the pandemic happened. COVID-19 changed the onboarding process for most employers as we all practice social distancing. And during the pandemic, Department of Homeland Security temporarily suspended the requirement for employers to review original documents in person and allowed employers to review electronic copies of these documents. However, the employers who inspected documents electronically during the pandemic were required to inspect the documents in person once normal business operations resumed and employees were returning to the office on a regular, consistent, or predictable basis. This led to the new updates of the Form I-9. In July, Department of Homeland Security made a very important announcement stating that starting August 1st, certain employers who were enrolled in E-Verify may use video conferencing to examine the identity and work authorization documents presented by a new employee to complete the Form I-9 process. And a new version of the Form I-9 will be available for employers to use that would allow employers to specifically indicate on the form whether this alternative video conferencing procedure was used to examine the identity and work authorization documents presented by the new employee. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over how certain employers were permitted to use video conferencing to satisfy the physical document examination requirement for some of the Form I-9s that were completed during the pandemic with an electronic review of the Section 2 documentation, as the deadline to complete the physical document examination has passed already. It was on August 30th. But if you have any questions about this, please contact me after this presentation. Now, we're going to talk about who can use this new alternative video conferencing procedure, the alternative procedure. Employers must meet the following requirements before they can use video conferencing to examine documents presented by a new employee. First, they must be enrolled in E-Verify with respect to all hiring sites in the United States that will use the alternative video conferencing procedure. They must also be in compliance with all the requirements of the E-Verify program, and they must continue to be in good standing in E-Verify at any time during which the employer uses the alternative video conferencing procedure. What are the required steps of the alternative procedure? First, the employee must send a scanned copy of the front and back of their identity and work authorization documents that they intend to present for Section 2. This can be either a scanned copy of a List A document or scanned copies of a combination of List B and List C documents. Step 2, the employer must examine the scanned copies to ensure that the documentation reasonably appears to be genuine. Step 3, the employer must conduct a video conference with the employee that's live, and the employee must present the same original documentation during the video conference to ensure that the documentation reasonably appears to be genuine and related to the employee. There are no format restrictions on how the documents are reviewed virtually, as long as it's live. Employers can use Teams, Zoom, iPhone, FaceTime, Skype, etc. Step 4. The employer must indicate on the Form I-9 that the alternative procedure was used to conduct the examination of the employee's documents. If the employer is using the new form, there's a new checkbox that the employer can use to indicate that they use the alternative procedure. If the employer is using the previous version of the Form I-9, they should note in the additional information box on the Form I-9 that the alternative procedure was used to examine the documentation. It's important to note that after October 31st, the prior version of the Form I-9 will no longer be valid. This means that starting November 1st, employers must use the August 1st, 2023 version of the form. Then, step 5, the employer must retain clear and legible copies of all the documentation used to complete Section 2 of the Form I-9. If there is an audit, the employer must be able to provide the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers with the copies of the identity and employment authorization documentation presented by the employee. Now we're going to go over some common questions about the alternative procedure. First question is, do employers have to use E-Verify to create a case for all newly hired employees to use the alternative procedure? The answer is yes. Once enrolled in E-Verify, employers are required to create a case for all newly hired employees. Second question, can qualified employers choose not to use the alternative procedure? The answer to this is yes. Employers are not required to use this alternative video conferencing option. It is an option, it's not a requirement. So employers may choose to conduct a physical inspection of the documents that an employee presents for Section 2. Can qualified employers choose to use the alternative procedure for some employees and not for others? Well, if an employer chooses to use the alternative procedure at an E-Verify hiring site, they must use it consistently for all employees at that site. But employers may choose to offer the alternative procedure for remote hires and use the physical examination process for employees who work on site. Employers can choose to do this as long as the employer does not treat employees differently based on their citizenship, immigration status, or national origin. Can employees refuse to present their documents using the alternative procedure? Or in other words, can an employee refuse to present their documents via video conferencing? The answer to this question is yes. If an employee does not want to submit their documents using the alternative procedure, the employer may not require the employee to use it. If this occurs, I recommend adding a note in the additional information box or attaching a memo to the Form I-9 that explains that the employee requested a physical inspection of the documents. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual Form I-9 and what changed in this new version. As I mentioned earlier, this new Form I-9 was available for use starting August 1st, and it's required starting November 1st. The biggest change is that sections 1 and 2 are now on one single page. In previous versions of the form, section 1 was on page 1 and section 2 was on page 2. Now, both sections are on one page. Another change to the Form I-9 is that the section 1 preparer translator certification box was moved and placed into a separate document called the Supplement A, which the employee can use if they are using a translator. Another change is that the re-verification and rehire section, section 3, was moved to a separate Supplement B. So overall, the Form I-9 is more condensed and hopefully a little bit more user-friendly. I noted here on the slide the section 1 and section 2 highlighted in yellow. And then at the bottom there, I highlighted the new checkbox that employers can check if they use the alternative procedure to review the identity and work authorization documents that an employee may present for section 2. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.